In the 1870s, Victorian London was celebrated as the heart of a global empire. Yet the streets below told a far more dangerous and uncomfortable story that most histories avoid. Beneath the glow of gas lamps and the promise of progress, everyday life unfolded in narrow alleys filled with noise, filth, and constant uncertainty. The shocking truth is that for many Londoners, simply stepping outside their door meant entering a world where disease, hunger, and violence were ordinary companions. Children worked instead of playing, families slept in overcrowded rooms, and the line between survival and collapse was thin enough to disappear overnight. What makes this period unsettling is not the poverty alone, but how normalized it became, woven into daily routines until hardship felt inevitable. Victorian London's streets were not just pathways through the city, they were environments that shaped behavior, endurance, and fear in ways rarely acknowledged. Street life was loud, chaotic, and relentlessly physical, driven by the need to earn money day by day. Vendors shouted, carts rattled over uneven roads, and workers crowded sidewalks from dawn until late at night. Many people lived and worked in the same spaces, turning streets into extensions of their homes, workplaces, and social lives. Waste flowed openly through gutters, mixing with rain and refuse, creating conditions where sickness spread easily and unpredictably. The poor navigated these streets daily, carrying goods, begging, or searching for work that might last only hours. For them, the street was not a place of movement, but a place of survival, where reputation, strength, and awareness mattered more than comfort. Victorian London functioned not because it was orderly, but because people adapted to disorder with remarkable resilience. What history often overlooks is how these streets shaped identity and community. Neighbors relied on one another for information, protection, and shared survival, forming bonds born from necessity rather than choice. Children learned quickly how to avoid danger, read moods, and find opportunity amid chaos. Even crime became part of the street's rhythm, understood as a risk rather than an exception. Victorian London's street life reveals a city powered by endurance more than progress, where ordinary people carried the cost of empire on their backs. Their lives were not defined by grand achievements, but by daily negotiation with hardship. In bringing this world to life, we see that the true story of Victorian London is not found in palaces or parliament, but in the streets, where survival was earned one day at a time. As the day wore on, the streets of Victorian London changed character, revealing layers of life that rarely appeared in official accounts. Morning brought labor and movement, but evening introduced exhaustion, desperation, and vulnerability. Gas lamps offered limited light, leaving long shadows where danger could hide, and many streets remained poorly lit or completely dark. Workers returning home carried their wages carefully, aware that theft was common and help was distant. Alcohol became both escape and necessity, filling pubs with those seeking warmth, company, or relief from relentless pressure. For many, the street never truly rested, because night did not bring safety, only a different kind of risk. London's evenings exposed how thin the line was between stability and collapse, especially for those living one missed payment away from homelessness. Despite these dangers, the street also served as a space of connection and culture. Music, conversation, and informal trade filled corners and courtyards, creating moments of life that resisted despair. Street performers drew small crowds, children played between carts, and neighbors shared news and warnings, forming an unspoken network of support. These interactions were not romantic escapes from hardship, but necessary expressions of humanity in an environment that offered little comfort. Victorian London streets were places where resilience was learned early and practiced daily. People survived not because conditions improved quickly, but because adaptability became second nature. In these crowded, unpredictable spaces, ordinary lives unfolded with strength and persistence, revealing a city sustained less by power and wealth than by the quiet endurance of those who lived within its streets. As industrial growth accelerated, the streets absorbed the pressure of a city expanding faster than its people could adapt. new arrivals poured in daily, drawn by rumors of work and opportunity, only to find overcrowding and competition that made survival increasingly fragile. Pavements became sleeping places for those who could not afford shelter, while doorways offered temporary refuge from rain and cold. The constant movement created tension, as strangers shared limited space with little privacy or security. Street life demanded awareness at all times, because a moment of distraction could lead to loss, injury, or worse. For many, the city's progress felt distant, visible only in buildings they could not enter or afford. Yet within this instability, informal systems developed that allowed life to continue. People learned where to stand, who to avoid, and how to recognize opportunity quickly. Street markets became essential sources of food and income, operating beyond official regulation and driven by trust and reputation rather than law. Children grew up fluent in this environment, navigating crowds with skill that came from necessity rather than training. Victorian London's streets were not simply places of hardship, but environments that forged resilience through constant challenge. They shaped individuals who understood survival as a daily task rather than a long-term plan. In this way, the street became both a threat and a teacher, offering lessons in endurance that defined life in the city. As years passed, the street became a mirror of Victorian London's deep inequalities, revealing how progress benefited some while exhausting others. Wealth and poverty existed only steps apart, separated not by distance, but by opportunity and protection. Carriages rolled past barefoot children, and well-dressed figures avoided eye contact with those who slept outside shops they could never enter. This contrast shaped resentment and acceptance in equal measure. Because the street offered no illusions about fairness, people learned quickly where they stood, and survival depended on understanding those boundaries. For the working poor, the street was not temporary hardship, but a permanent condition that shaped every decision, from where to walk to whom to trust. Even so, moments of solidarity appeared where least expected. Neighbors shared food, warned each other of danger, and offered brief shelter when possible. Because survival improved through cooperation, these small acts did not erase hardship, but they softened its edges, allowing life to continue with some dignity intact. Victorian London's street life reveals a city sustained not by wealth alone, but by the endurance and mutual awareness of ordinary people. The street was harsh, unpredictable, and often unforgiving, yet it was also where resilience was built and tested daily. In understanding these streets, we uncovered the real engine of Victorian London, not its empire or industry, but the human capacity to adapt and persist in environments that offered little mercy. As the decade progressed, the rhythms of street life hardened into patterns that few could escape, shaping not only survival but identity itself. People became known by their place on the street, the corner they worked, the route they walked, the hours they kept, because stability came from familiarity rather than security. The street remembered everything. Reputations spread quickly, and trust was earned slowly through consistency. A person who disappeared was noticed, not because life paused, but because absence was unusual in a place defined by constant presence. Illness, injury, or sudden poverty could erase someone from daily view, reminding others how fragile their own position was. Victorian London streets taught people to measure life in days rather than dreams, because long-term certainty rarely existed. Looking back, the real street life of Victorian London reveals a city powered by human endurance more than innovation. Progress marched forward in factories and institutions, but it was on the streets that its cost was paid in full. Ordinary people learned to navigate danger, scarcity, and inequality with awareness sharpened by necessity. Their lives were not defined by the ideals of the era, but by the ability to persist in environments that demanded constant adjustment. In bringing these streets to life, we see a London rarely shown, one where survival was not heroic or dramatic, but continuous and demanding. The true story of Victorian London is found not in monuments or records, but in the daily struggle of those who walked its streets and learned, through hardship, how to endure. As the city moved toward the end of the 19th century, The streets of Victorian London carried the weight of everything the city had become: crowded, restless, and shaped by decades of unrelenting pressure. Reforms slowly appeared in laws and institutions, but on the ground, change felt distant and uneven. For many, daily life remained a careful negotiation with exhaustion, poverty, and risk, where improvement came slowly, if at all. The streets still demanded awareness, adaptability, and strength, because survival depended less on promises of progress and more on personal endurance. People learned to live with uncertainty as a permanent condition, adjusting expectations and finding meaning in small victories rather than long-term security. London's streets did not soften easily because they reflected a society still learning how to balance growth with humanity. In the end, the real street life of Victorian London tells a story that official histories often avoid, one of ordinary people carrying the burden of an extraordinary city. These streets were not merely scenes of hardship, but places where resilience was formed through repetition and necessity. The empire's power and wealth were built upon lives shaped by crowded pavements, uncertain nights, and relentless work. By understanding this world, we see Victorian London not as a triumph alone, but as a city sustained by human endurance under constant strain. The streets were harsh, demanding, and unforgiving, yet they reveal a deeper truth about survival: that progress is lived first by those who endure its cost, one step at a time, in places where history rarely stops to look. As memory fades and stone replaces footprints, the lived reality of Victorian London's streets risks being reduced to statistics and dates, yet the human experience remains essential to understanding the city's past. Every pavement carried countless stories of effort, failure, and persistence, lived by people whose names were never recorded, but whose labor sustained the city's rhythm. These streets shaped character as much as circumstance, teaching endurance through repetition and awareness through hardship. Survival was rarely dramatic, but it was constant, requiring attention to small details that determined whether a day ended safely or not. Victorian London did not soften its streets for those who lived there, and in return its people became hardened, adaptive, and resourceful. The city moved forward because they did, step by step. In revisiting the real street life of Victorian London, we uncover a truth that remains relevant long after the era has passed. Progress is not only measured by growth and innovation, but by the human cost paid along the way. The streets were classrooms of survival, shaping generations who learned how to live with uncertainty and inequality without surrendering entirely to despair. These ordinary lives, lived in extraordinary conditions, form the foundation of the city's history. Victorian London endures in memory not just through its buildings and power, but through the resilience of those who walked its streets daily, carrying the unseen weight of a city that demanded everything and gave very little in return.